Good morning, everyone, and happy International Women's Day. I'm Adrienne Arsht, Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council, founder of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center and the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center. If I could have chosen an opening song for today's conversation, it would have been Anything Goes. Because what I'm wearing today would not have been acceptable 45 years ago when I came to work in the legal department of Trans World Airlines. If the only place they would hire women was either as a stewardess or in the legal department. And when the announcement came that maybe a year after I'd started, that women could wear pantsuits, I walked in a pantsuit, and the male lawyer in the office next to me walked in and said, "God did not intend women to wear pantsuits." Equally, I'm not wearing stockings. From the song Anything Goes, we had to wear stockings. A glimpse of stocking, though, was looked on as something shocking. That's because your skirt was so long. Back in 1996, when I went to run my bank in Miami, the dress code required women to wear stockings. And I left it there for a while, and then I thought, no, stockings are an accessory. Equally, women had to wear closed toe and heel shoes. If you could see what I'm wearing, I have open toe and open heel. So I changed the dress code there. So, as in the Virginia Slims, we've come a long way, baby. We don't smoke anymore. But those were the battles and the issues of my time. There's still so much, sadly, to be done. I opened the newspaper today, and the headline, "Female Genital Cutting Remains Rampant." So I may have gotten some things changed, but you all have a lot more to do. Now, I want to speak of a woman who did something spectacular, and that is the American woman who sailed solo around the world. So we continue to fight and to break barriers. But in many parts of the world, including Latin America and the Caribbean, women are still victims of violence simply for being women. They have less opportunities in the workforce and in political leadership. They are more vulnerable to climate changes just for being women. In partnership with the UN Women Multi-Country Office Caribbean, today's conversation and the report that we are launching today focuses on how elevating women and girls can actually lead to socioeconomic development. And simply for being humans, we should all advocate for that. And with that, I will pass the floor to my dear and very badass friend, Ambassador in Residence and Vice Chair of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center's Advisory Council, Ambassador Capricia Marshall.
Thank you. Thank you so very much for that, Adrienne. It is so special to have you here today with us. What your life's work stands for, what you stand for, is emblematic of the distance that women have run, the heights that they can reach, and the imprint that they can make. Adrienne, you're an inspiration to us all. I am so happy to welcome each and every one of you joining us in person here at the Atlantic Council in our fabulous studio, and virtually from all over the world. International Women's Day is an opportunity to celebrate the progress made toward gender equality, but also a yearly call for action to address the challenges women and girls still face around the world. Latin America and the Caribbean countries have made important strides towards gender equality. But as Adrienne so properly, so perfectly just said, from violence against women to economic inequality, women have a long way to go. Which is why we are here to dig deeper into the solutions and to have these conversations with these extraordinary women you will meet today, and how to address these issues to lead the region even further into development. To help us kick off and properly kick off this wonderful conversation, I am so pleased to welcome Maria Noel Vaesa. Maria Noel is the Regional Director of UN Women for the Americas and the Caribbean. As Regional Director, she oversees the institutions, projects, and programs across the continent, advancing gender equality and the empowerment of women across the Americas. Last year, UN Women partnered with Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center to advance gender equality, equity, and security in the Caribbean specifically. Today, we are so happy to launch a brand new report stemming from a multi-month collaborative effort with UN Women. The report, Not Without Her, a roadmap for gender equality and Caribbean prosperity, authored by our very own Valentina Satter and Wazim Mwala, offers pathways forward to addressing the most pressing gender challenges in the Caribbean, with a particular focus on Guyana and Jamaica. If you haven't done so already, I encourage you to take a copy today here at the Council, or to scan the QR code in the stream for those joining us virtually. Maria Noel, we are thrilled with this partnership, and thanking UN Women for their unwavering support of the Atlantic Council. And a lot of what this partnership has found is directly related to the theme of this year's International Women's Day, Inspire Inclusion. I want to hear, I know we all want to hear, your thoughts on the interlinkages between inclusion and the broader development of the region. Could Latin America and Caribbean, or any region as a matter of fact, foster development if women and girls are not included? How can we make sure that the tide of progress that lifts the standards of living also lifts those of women and girls?
Good morning.
Good
Happy
morning.
Women's Day to everybody. And it's a good day for celebration, for commemoration, but also every day is a good day for women's celebration. Let me thank you very much, Ambassador Caprice Marshall from the Adrienne Arsht American Center, and for the Atlantic Council for this invitation. I want to thank and congratulate the Atlantic Council on the impactful work you have been doing in America and the Caribbean, and also globally. And we look forward to deepening our collaboration of not only of products of knowledge, but also our collaboration, our engagement to create an enable environment for women for sustainable development. Today's theme is essential. How do we finance women that are in poverty? Unfortunately, in our region, the feminization of poverty is an issue, and it's an issue that is been growing in several countries. Our region has also been affected increasingly by the deterioration in human rights, the reduction of democratic spaces, the increase in human mobility. We have more than 8 million people in human mobility, a rise in violence against women, and as well as a movement that is not in favor of the human rights of women, unfortunately. And also a backlash against women's organization that we need to preserve. Women's organizations are essential. They know what women need. And also a rise in attacks against women's human rights defenders and activists. Our region is a region that has the most murder of human rights activists.
Wow.
And this is shameful. And we have to protect the women that are activists and human rights protectors. Latin America is also a region of increased vulnerability to the risks of emergency and disasters caused by climate changes and the continued effect of climate changes, as well as a region impacted by considerable flows of migrants and refugees with an important level of human mobility, particularly affecting women and children. I live in Panama, and it's amazing how the passage through the Darien jungle has been from 5,000 people to 500,000 people in 1 year. So we have a crisis. It's a silent crisis, and it's a crisis with the face of women. Only 40% of data required to track the progress of the Sustainable Development Goal number 5 of women equality are currently available. We have a problem of data. There's no enough data to divide between men and women, effectively to put women visible. So this is important that we continue investing in data and continue separated how women are affected disproportionately in all the horrible crises that we are having around the world and in the region. 25% of the target of which we have information allow us to forecast that unfortunately we are not going to get there to achieve the SDG 5. So we have to accelerate. We have to accelerate for equality. It's time to take action towards solutions for increasing women's representation in leadership, in decision-making, in redistributing the care work. And this is why we have focused our attention in creating integrated systems of care, public, private, but also community, but also in essential services, particularly for women that are survivors of violence. International Women's Day is a day where it's time to honor the social, economic, cultural, and political achievement of women that they are unfortunately still invisible. But we are the constructors, co-creators, and we have the amazing energy that drives this region. But only 52% of women in the region work. And unfortunately, the work they have access is informal. So we have to continue fighting for women's participation in the economy, to get decent works, and to ensure that they have care system to leave their kids, their elderly, and their disabled. And that's why it's so important to invest in women to accelerate those progress.
Oh, you couldn't be more spot on. Thank you so very much, Maria Noel, for that. You've talked about, in a big way, what needs to happen in the future. Can you just elaborate a little bit more for us and for this audience? Vis-a-vis 10 years ago, Adrienne gave us a glimpse to the past, and looking a little bit, in your experience, expertise, what areas can we see where we are improving? Is there a hopeful trajectory? We've seen in some areas, and we had a little bit of a discussion this earlier, where we're being pulled back. Where are we making improvements, and what are the priorities? Where do we need to prioritize our efforts?
Of course, there are progress. I mean, we are going to celebrate next year 30 years of the last International Women's Conference that was in Beijing, and the plan of action that arrived from that conference, the plan of action of Beijing. The progress are in education. We have more women today that come out of universities than men. That's why we are so much prepared, but unfortunately, we're not yet in politics. We're not yet in the decision. And keep these figures in mind. 70% of the parliaments of the region are composed by men. 85% of the mayors of the region are men. This is not good. Those are figures that we need to change. We need to put more women in politics. We have only one president woman in Honduras that was elected, and we have the Prime Minister of Barbados that is a fabulous woman, Maya Moore. But we have a president woman in Peru, but she was not elected. She is there because of the president that was ousted. But only two women elected, one in the Caribbean and one in Latin America. This is too low. We have to elect more women to the presidency, to the parliaments. And this is why we are pushing for legal frameworks of parities. We need to have parity. We are more than 50% of the population, so we need 50% of women in representation. The same is in the private sector. The private sector is not better. We have only 9% of women CEOs in the region and only 11% of women in the boards of the companies. And it is proven, we have data, that the more women participate in companies, and the woman.
Oh. We're having a frozen moment, I think. You know, her points are so well taken. Investment, investment, investment. We have to invest.
Sorry about that.
No worries, no worries. I was filling in for you there a little bit.
But I was saying that it's proven that the more women participate in the boards of the companies and in the senior management of the company, those companies value 40% more in the market and earn profits 30% more. So it is a good business. I don't understand why people are thinking about this. This is a good business, and it's a good business to create decent jobs for women. So we have to push women as well in the private sector. So this is where we are, and this is what we should be. And that's why we need accelerating measures. Also, we need to tackle violence against women. And I believe very strongly that the more women have access to credit, have access to opportunities to work, to entrepreneur, they will face violence in a different manner. They will run away. They will have opportunity to run away. The problem now is that they are trapped because there is an economic violence as well. Don't forget that a man that is toxic will not allow the woman to work. And then the violence increases because it can start with economic violence, but it goes afterwards in physical violence. So we have to be very careful there. We have still 4,000 women in the region that are killed every year because they're women, feminicides. And that number is not going down. We have countries like Mexico, it's 11 women a day. So this is something that is an emergency that we have to pay attention. We have to free women of violence. This is critical for us to continue growing. And for that, we need economic opportunities.
Absolutely.
We need economic autonomy. It's time to take action to provide women to decent work and to provide women with access to credit and to provide women with this financing that they need. We're not asking for donations. We are asking for opportunities for women because the energy that women have is amazing. So we can do whatever.
You are a perfect example of that energy. I just love it. You know, and you hit on a point. You know, women are major consumers, and so put them in the boardroom. They know what people want to buy. Put them in your boardroom. So it just is, it's a good business decision. It's an excellent business decision. I want to wrap up our conversation with this last question here, Maria Noel. This year's theme for International Women's Day is Inspire Inclusion, which embodies a call to action globally in support of women and girls. With the recent news from across Latin America and the Caribbean, and in a year of major elections across the region, what would be the theme of Women's Day for the Americanas and Caribbeanas?
Well, for us, it's essential the implementation of the commitment of Buenos Aires. That, you know, our region is the only region that has a women regional conference for the last 46 years. And the last one was in Buenos Aires. The next one will be in Mexico next year. So you're all invited for November next year to be in Mexico. It's a wonderful opportunity to get all the women from the civil society, feminist movement, governments, private sector, academia together. So let's go to Mexico. But for me, the commitment of Buenos Aires is critical because it calls for the implementation of care systems that allow the most pressure issue that women have, which is time. Because we care 3 times more for the unpaid care work in our families, food, caring for children, caring for elderly, for the parent, our parents and the parents of our partners. You know, we don't have time to be entrepreneur, to study, or to self-care. We don't have time. We don't care for each other, and that's why we have a serious issues of mental health, because we work too much. We work 1 day extra a week because there's no co-responsibility in the care. So for us, care is essential. It's a paradigm that was approved in Buenos Aires to design a care society where women are at the center, but also at the center is the biodiversity and the environment of our region that is so much super rich. So recognizing the importance of investing in systems of care is essential to allow women to go to work, to generate employment of quality in the care system, because don't forget that the caregivers are informal. We cannot have caregiver in the informal sector. We have to certify them. We have to make them important. We have to give them dignity. So for me, it's a 3 dividends that we get. The dividend in the family, the dividend in creating work, in creating decent work, and also the compound effect that allows women to go to work. So imagine if we can have this everywhere, women are going to go from 52% to 80% in the economy. And this region will be booming, will be better than any other region. And this is what we need. We need women in the labor market, but we need to support women for the care and the core responsibility. We have to recognize, redistribute, and reduce the unpaid care work. The last thing I want to say, we did studies in many countries, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, Uruguay. How much is the time that women use in the unpaid care work? And you know, it's 25% of the GDP. It means that the development of the countries is in our shoulders for free. So we have to recognize that, and recognize that without women, this region will not be able to get out of the poor levels of growth. So let's invest in women, and let's give women decent jobs. Thank you.
Maria Noel, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for this partnership. Thank you so much for your energy and your insights and your just critical time on this very, very special day, International Women's Day. Happy International Women's Day to you. We hope to see you in person sometime soon, right here. We'll also come to Panama, and we'll also see you in Mexico. We promise you that. And now,
thank you so much for inviting me.
Excellent, excellent. Oh, now we continue this very important conversation, and I want to pass this time along to my dear friend and colleague, Valentina Sutter, who will discuss with this extraordinary panel several of the issues that we just addressed and so much more. Valentina?
Thank you, Capricia. Thank you, everyone. I think that we were just inspired by all of this conversation, this positive view on gender and the progress that we've made so far. And I wanted to continue on that route, but dive deeper into Latin America and the Caribbean in particular. And for that, I'm delighted to welcome an incredible group of experts and women leaders right here with me today. I will start by joining us to celebrate International Women's Day, but also her birthday is Laura Liswood. She is the Secretary General of the Council of Women World Leaders, a network dedicated to mobilizing the highest level women leaders on issues of critical importance to women, especially women's full political participation and future leaders. Laura, happy birthday. Thank you for joining us. And in the studios with me today, we have Deputy Assistant Secretary Carrie Henning. She is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public Policy, Policy Planning and Coordination at the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs in the U.S. State Department. Welcome, Deputy Assistant Secretary. I'm also joined by Maria Caridad Araujo. She is the Chief of the Gender and Diversity Division at the Inter-American Development Bank, where she leads efforts to improve access to quality services, economic opportunities, and strengthen the voice and representation of women, indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, people with disabilities, and LGBTQ+ community. Welcome, Maria Caridad. And last but not least, all the way from Mexico, we have Gabriela Warkentin. She is a distinguished communicator, academic, and businesswoman. She directs and hosts the popular morning news program Así las Cosas on W Radio in Mexico, and is the host and producer of Al Habla con Warkentin, a weekly interview podcast on El País. She is a member of multiple organizations, including Article 19, which defends freedom of expression as well as the protection of female journalists. Welcome, Gabriela. Welcome to the four of you. Thank you so much for joining me. Before we start, I do want to invite our in-person audience as well as those joining us virtually to participate in this conversation by sending your questions through the link sac.org. With that, I'm going to begin with Laura. You, of course, Latin America and the Caribbean is not the only region in the world that faces and has gender challenges. And we see this, we talked about this all over the world. Women across the world stand at an unequal economic footing, are less represented in politics, and in fact are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change. I'd like it if you could talk about the best practices, whether in policies or programs that stood out to you for their effectiveness in empowering women even further and helping them actually reach leadership roles.
Thank you very much for having me, and greetings to my great and wonderful friend Adrienne Arsht, who's an incredible, inspiring leader, and also my good friend Ambassador Capricia Marshall. I'm delighted to be able to be here with you. You're absolutely right, Valentina, that this is not an issue that's isolated to Latin or South America. This is around the world. In fact, no country, according to the World Economic Forum Gender Gap Report, has accomplished and closed the gaps in every sphere: education, health, economics, or politics. So even what I call the Nordic nirvanas haven't closed the gaps either. And in some cases, we have some very interesting data around what's called the Nordic paradox, which is that the more women are involved and engaged in the economic sphere, the more money they make, the more power that they have, the more likely they are going to be subject to domestic violence. So it's not just a connection between poverty or lack of financial resources. There's actually a kind of a U-curve on this. So we haven't solved the problem on either end with reference to economics. There's a lot of best practices that are going on. I'm very happy to hear that you are creating further data with the Not Without Her report. I think data are probably some of the most important things that we can do for best practices, because otherwise everything remains anecdotal and people don't actually, believe that things are happening, and therefore legislation doesn't get passed, et cetera, without this kind of data. So I think disaggregating data by gender is really important. There are obviously a number of things that make for more robust participation of women in the economy, education being first and foremost, training, having a development of training programs, childcare support, flexible work, fair parental leave. A number of countries who do have fair parental leave, although getting men to actually take that fair parental leave is often hard. Some countries are tackling the kinds of unconscious bias that we see around the world, what kind of gendered roles there are, what does the social media look like. There are a few countries, and there needs to be, really globally, there needs to be far more laws against online harassment, cyberbullying, et cetera. Women politicians, for example, are 9 times more likely to get verbally harassed or threatened online than men are. So legislation is really going to be crucial going forward. One of the challenges I think we have is that technological progress is certain. We know that. All of our technologies are getting better. Social progress is not certain. We can go back to the Middle Ages just as easily as we can go forward. In some cases, we have seen this. We have seen a backlash against women. I was just reading a research report from King's College, where in Britain at least, 50% of people in Britain believe that that the society has gone too far in terms of gender equality, and that now it's that men are getting discriminated against. So it's not surprising that we see a lot of this sort of backlash going on. Participation in the workforce, yes, Latin and South America have kind of one of the largest gaps in participation in the workforce. That's going to require, more willingness of organizations to hire women, to train women, also to get them out of the service sectors, to get them into the more manufacturing and hard industries, if you will, and to have the government reinforce these kinds of positions, having more flexible work, obviously, closing gender gaps. Lots of countries now, particularly in Europe, now mandate showing what the gender gaps are in wages. So I think there's lots to do, and we can talk some more about this as this comes up. But I think what we have to do is make sure that we understand that at this point, there's no progress without struggle, as Frederick Douglass said in the United States. I think we can move forward. Often people ask me if we're making progress, and I immediately go to an anecdote with John Major and Boris Yeltsin. John Major, former Prime Minister of Great Britain, called Boris Yeltsin and said to him, "Tell me in one word, Boris, how it's going in Russia." And Yeltsin responds, "Good." And Major says, "Well, maybe you ought to expand on that. Tell me in 2 words how it's going in Russia." And Yeltsin responds, "Not good." So I think we're in this position, in this place and time, where we're both going forward and there are pressures that are pulling us back. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you for the anecdote. And honestly, hopefully we can see more progress and further progress. You mentioned some of the aspects of economic empowerment and women's inclusion in economics in particular. And I know that our second conversation will go deeper into the Caribbean in particular and some of the trips that we actually took to the region to be able to understand the issues in the Caribbean with gender in particular. And there are quite a few stories there that I think are worth sharing. So please do read the report, because we tried to get into that as well. But bringing it back to the United States in particular, we are convinced here at the Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council that only through cooperation is that we can actually get things done. And honestly, thinking about the U.S. in the Americas, what are some of the roles? What has been this administration priority in terms of gender equity and vis-a-vis Latin America in particular, but also toward its own citizens, towards its own country?
Well, thank you, Valentina, and happy International Day, Women's Day to those joining us virtually and in person. I'm really happy to be here today with Laura and Maria and Gabriela, and I really appreciated Maria Noel's points as well. I want to say first that advancing gender equality remains a top priority of the Biden-Harris administration. Most are aware that in October 21, President Biden launched the first ever national strategy on gender equity and equality to advance gender rights, both domestically and abroad, by prioritizing areas of education, public health, security, law, and democracy. At the State Department, where I work in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, we are committed to ensuring the rights of women and girls remain central to U.S. foreign policy in the region. We do recognize that many political, economic, and social challenges throughout the hemisphere, and especially the heavy burden these challenges place on marginalized communities exist. Their impact on women of African descent, indigenous women, women with disabilities, and LGBTQI women as well. I also want to acknowledge the disproportionate impact that climate change and other environmental disasters have on women. And I think I want to highlight that the department created the first Race, Ethnicity, and Social Inclusion Unit inside of the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs to integrate equity into foreign policy in the Americas and lead initiatives that engage marginalized communities, including women and girls. We consider them stakeholders in our policy formulation and program development. We also partner closely with the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues to advance the rights of opportunities of women and girls throughout the regions, and we have a particular focus on Indigenous women and women in the Caribbean. We participate in dialogues, fund grants towards addressing gender equality and preventing and addressing gender-based violence. We also participate in the Trilateral Working Group on Violence Against Indigenous Women and Girls through the North American Leaders Summit to address high levels of violence, unfortunately, that exist against Indigenous women and girls in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. We also work through the Gender Equality and Equity Action Fund to advance women's economic security by supporting women's employment in public and private sectors and women-owned small businesses. In 2023, in fact, we funded gendered equitable access to economic resources and training for women-owned business in Central America and the Dominican Republic. Our Bureau also administers grants targeted toward the prevention of and access to support services for gender-based violence, which remains a huge scourge. And we have worked with Ecuador to improve sexual violence and harassment response frameworks in education, and we've worked to empower healthcare and civil society and municipal governments to address root causes of gender-based violence in Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Uruguay, among others. I also want to highlight when our presidential delegation attended the inauguration of President Arevalo in January in Guatemala, we announced a new cohort of what we call the Academy of Women Entrepreneurs, where we'll be training over 500 women in entrepreneur skills to grow their small businesses. This is a public diplomacy program administered by our embassies that has reached over 4,000 people in 26 countries to give them skills for entrepreneurship to help raise up women, because we all know when you raise up women, you raise up communities. And I want to finally offer that we work to lift women's voices. Just in this last week, I have met with our International Women of Courage nominees from Ecuador and Haiti, and the conversation I had with them and learning from their personal experiences informs our foreign policy. And I also this year had a chance to participate in the first annual Indigenous Youth Forum, which brought together happened to all be women, Indigenous leaders who were making changes in their communities. So we continue to look for those voices and use that information to strengthen our foreign policy and to reach out to those communities. So thank you for the opportunity today.
Absolutely, and thank you for sharing all that is being done by the United States to empower women and to advocate for women and girls' rights. I think that one of the, elevating women's voices is such a important part of this effort. We at the Atlantic Council also have, especially at the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center, a campaign during the month of March, an annual campaign called Mujeres at the Table, that we strive to bring women to the decision-making table, to the negotiating table. So definitely something that we are aligned there, and cooperation is definitely something to foster. You mentioned a few times gender-based violence, and this is one of the aspects of focus of this report, and also one of the biggest challenges perhaps that we see women and girls facing in the world. Maria Caridad, I wanted to turn to you because, economic empowerment is often seen as an opportunity for women to escape these situations. When we went to the Caribbean, we heard and saw a lot of the challenges also being a fear of sexual violence within their work environment. And this is a constant issue and ingrained in their society in a way. I wanted to ask you in terms of, your experience at the Inter-American Development Bank, your experience working with Latin America and the Caribbean in particular. How do we address this? What policies have proven the most successful in Latin America and the Caribbean in improving women's economic well-being? And what does the IDB research suggest? I know that you launched recently a report on this.
Thank you very much, Valentina. Thank you to the Atlantic Council and to UN Women on Mujeres for hosting this event. It's an honor to be here also with my fellow panelists. So first, I'll start by saying that as several of you have recognized, there's been important progress in many dimensions in terms of women and girls' well-being in the region. And yet, a lot of challenges and important challenges persist. So to give you an example, participation in the labor force has grown persistently. However, it is still at 65%, so it can grow even more. Okay, sorry. Is this better?
Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry. And also, gender gaps in participation have consistently fallen over the last decades. They have fallen 43 percentage points. That's a huge drop. Now, what is most salient about inequality, gender inequality in the labor force, not only in Latin America but throughout the world, is that women consistently earn less than men. And if we just look at average hourly earnings among women and men in Latin America, women earn 12% less than men. And that gap has remained constant in the region. That hasn't changed. Now, this data doesn't consider the reality that women are more educated than men today, as Maria Noel was saying. So if we focus on women that are actively in the active labor force, on average, they have 1 more year of education than men. So if all that mattered to explain earnings was their education, they should be earning more than men, and yet they're earning less. So once we re-estimate these earning gaps, controlling for education and other factors, we see that gender earnings gap, it's not 12%, but 22%. And most worryingly, it has grown over the last 2 decades. It has not shrunk. So those are big realities and big issues of concern. Now, why do we see that earnings gap, that gender earnings gap? Part of that gap is explained, as the panelists that went before me recognized, by the fact that women are overrepresented in certain sectors that pay less, from services to care and other professions. However, when we actually control for those sectors and occupations in the research, we recognize that that only explains 20% of those earning gaps. So there is a very large share of those gaps that are not only explained by that occupational segregation, which is important, but it's not the whole story. What do we see as the key explaining factor? It is precisely what in the economics literature is often known as the child penalty. The fact that when women have a child, particularly the first child, their participation in the labor market in Latin America falls 20 to 40 percentage points and doesn't recover. That is not something we see when men have a child. And this has been estimated and shown to be a fact not only outside of Latin America and the Caribbean, but also in our region. Now, something that is also very important, where I want to reflect with you, is that in our region, another salient factor is that our economies, both employment and firms, operate largely in the informal sector. And that is a difference between Latin America and other parts of the world. Informality has given women some flexibility to remain employed after the birth of her children. But at what cost? In many cases, at the cost of better quality jobs, careers, and also in the longer term, at the cost of their own security in old age and pensions. So while informality has acted as a mechanism to smooth some of that loss, it is definitely not an optimal scenario from a policy perspective. Now, let me also acknowledge that women also exit the labor force later in their lives. When they need, not only when they become moms for the first time, but when they need to care, sometimes for grandchildren at an early age, because we still see a very high rate of adolescent pregnancy in the region, and our research has shown that. And also when they need to care for elderly parents and other relatives. We also, research from the IDB in Mexico has estimated these also represent an exit from the labor market and the number of hours worked. And many times for women in, for example, the formal sector, it might be at a moment in their careers where they are actually occupying leadership roles or important roles within their organizations. Now, what can we do? What type of policies do we need to think about? First, how do we need to think about it? I think two elements of how to think about policies, policies with focus and policies with intentionality. And I want to go back here to this reality. A lot of the evidence that the economics literature has on closing gender gaps comes from Europe and the United States, where informality is not as salient and prevalent as it is in Latin America. So we really need to think of the toolbox we have in the region that recognizes the characteristics of our economies to close these gender gaps. It might be that the policies that have worked, for example, at the level of the firm, through taxes, to reduce gender gaps in other parts of the world, they might not be as effective in our region. So it really requires that we think differently about these issues. The second aspect, as Maria Noel and others have mentioned, is thinking about care. But what about care? We need to think about high quality care, because the region in many countries has had a history of expanding access to subsidized care. But there are key questions we need to focus when we expand access to subsidized care. First, the quality aspect, because families will not use services that are not of good quality. Research from many places in the world, Canada, US, and even Latin America has shown that in early childhood, for example, services that are not of good quality might actually harm children. And definitely that is not a smart investment in our societies and our future, and definitely families will not use those services. We also need to think about how those services meet the needs of the women who are using them and the families who are using them. If they're working in the informal sector, how they're targeted, how their schedules, and how they connect with the type of jobs of the families they serve. So that's a second aspect where both IDB has worked very actively and where we need more policy and more effort. Now, there we need to recognize that care is not cheap, and care requires an investment. So investing in the care infrastructure is something that the region needs to take more seriously, especially at moments where fiscal space is tight, as right now. And that is a reality that we need to elevate to the discussion of planning ministries, finance ministries. It is not an issue only of the sector of social development, ministries of women, et cetera. No, it is a big economic policy issue. And lastly, the third area where I think our research or policies tell us we need to do more is really changing that chip, that cultural chip of social norms and expectations of what is expected of boys and what is expected from girls. What about men and women? And there, too, we need to work harder through the education system, working with families, not only because this is closing opportunities for girls to access higher paying jobs, leadership, and many other things, but also because it's closing opportunities for boys. For example, from accessing the opportunity to care. Care is also an act of love, and one that can give a lot of satisfaction to the person providing care and allows us to build meaningful connections. Why are we not offering that opportunity to everyone in the region? So I want to leave with that reflection.
And honestly, I think that's a very important point, and I think the perfect segue into my question to you, Gabriela, because social norms and the perceptions of what roles and gender roles in particular that men and women play in society actually don't allow us to develop further and to tap into the potential that we have as a region. in terms of that, in terms of shaping narratives, in terms of shaping social norms, I think that the media has a very important role to play there. And I wanted to take advantage of having you here and your perspective as a journalist on the role that they can play, the role that media can play in reducing these gender gaps in Latin America and the Caribbean. What roles does journalism play in advancing these solutions to gender challenges, in particular in the Americas? How do we use the media to also help shape these social norms?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for to the Atlantic Council, to UN Women, and also to the U.S.-Mexico Foundation who brought us over. These days, we broadcasted our radio show here from Washington yesterday and today. So I have been speaking today almost 5 hours because we start very early, and so I hope I can explain myself good about what we're going to talk about. And there are many things that I want to take on that you just talked about, and that also on the first panel was also there. And I start by what was said about social progress is not certain. And I think that we need to have this in mind, that social progress is not certain. And what we do in media and what we do in journalism, we should have these in mind all the time, because that's what we're talking about, what we're narrating, and the way we are narrating stuff. So I have some ideas that I want to share with you, what we are doing in journalism. First of all, we need to look at those who work in journalism. Because you're talking about informality, about inequality, but that happens also within the media industry. I mean, it's not that we are on the side of it. I mean, we do live also those same inequalities, or those same like working condition, labor condition, where you do work. For example, I know you host a radio show, you work all day, but then you also have a family, but then you also, I mean, it's the same. It's not that we are on the side of society, we're within society. And this morning, a friend of mine just gave me this data, which I think is quite interesting. It's from the Reuters Institute at the Oxford University, and it says that only 24% of the top editors across 240 major news outlets in 12 markets are women. Only 24% of them. But if we go by countries, well, Japan is 0%, which is something that struck me. But Mexico has only 6%. 6% of the top editors across major news outlets in Mexico are women. And the other country, the other Latin American country that is there is Brazil, where it's 23%. But in Mexico, it's only 6%. Some years ago, I was a director of a major news radio station, and it was across the country. It was like me and two other women that we were actually directing or general editors of a news outlet. So we have to think about those who actually work in journalism. Where are the women in journalism, and where are the women that are actually taking editorial decisions? Because of course there are a lot of reporters. I was the dean of a communication school in Mexico for many years, and we had a lot of women studying communication and journalism, mainly, even at some points, even more women than men. And of course, we have a lot of women that are doing, I don't know, like reporters' jobs and so on, which is very important. But those who make editorial decisions are less and less women. And that is also something that we have to consider. And I'm sure that if we go through other countries in Latin America, the numbers are going to be between Mexico and Brazil. I'm not sure that maybe in Chile there's a little bit of a change, but not much. So I would start with that. Then the other thing is the stories that we actually tell. What stories do we tell? What stories do we report? What news stories do we follow? Where do we point our interest to if we are deciding, for example, my radio show? I have a radio show that goes on for 4 hours every day. How do I decide what stories we're going to have on this radio show? Today is, as you know, in Mexico for the last couple of years, or a little bit more, like 5 or 6 years, a lot of women take to the streets on March 8th. And this is sort of new. Maybe today it's not that new anymore, but it was new like 5 or 6 years ago. So what happened to media when they saw a lot of women walking through the streets? And women, some of them were just chanting, but some of them were also quite angry, and I'm sure they had reasons for being angry. And many things happened during these rallies. And what we saw the next day on media were those let's say, like bad things that happened. The women that were destroying something, that they were painting or graffiting the walls and so on. But they never showed the whole picture of it. So when you saw the front page of the newspapers or even the news shows, when you saw them, it seemed like everything was destruction, and it seems like there was no reason for destruction. So you had a lot of men mainly, or of course women also, but they were saying, okay, it's very good that you take to the streets, but behave. No? So, but that was part of what we were telling through the media, because we were only showing and only broadcasting the bad things, the bad behavior, and we were not telling the whole story. I'm sure that this is going to change a lot today, because many things have happened, because there was actually 2 years ago, there was a collective of women that went to one of the newspapers, and they started boycotting even the entrance to the building, and they said, you are covering us in a very bad way and in a very disrespectful way. And this newspaper actually decided that they were going to change and that they were going to tell a different story. So maybe what we're going to see tomorrow, what they tell about what happens today, is going to be a little bit different, maybe a little bit more balanced, because also there are many more women like me that I host a radio show, and some other women that host news shows. But the stories that we tell is very important, the stories that we choose and the way that we choose to tell those stories. And then also the agenda that we build and the agenda that we highlight. Mexico, as you know, is a country where feminicide is high. And there are some states in Mexico where feminicide is really high. And so talking about violence against women, you have to talk about, real harsh violence against women. So how do we not lose track of those stories? How do we follow the stories? How do we talk to for example, when I interview a mother of some girl that has been killed, and she tells us all the story on air, what I always try to do when we end the conversation is, tell us something that you want us to remember from your child. Tell us something. How was she? What did she like? And then she starts. Normally, they always tell something beautiful about their daughters. I don't know, whatever. She wanted to study. She did that. And I say, okay, let's try to remember that this was a person, that this was a woman, that she had a smile, that she had parents that were looking for her. So I think that we have to build that agenda. We're also trying to explain better what it means to have a care society, because our current president has been very vocal, saying that women should take care of their families, that it's part of our job as daughters or as wives or as whatever, that we have to take care of our elderly or young people, the youngers. And he talks about a lot about, I don't know, like grandparents that have to look after their grandsons and granddaughters and so on. So it has not been easy to highlight the importance of care economy, because most people say, why do we have to pay for that if you have to take care of your family? So that is something that we have, the agenda that we build, where do we look at, and what are we going to highlight? And then also the voices that we highlight, or the voices that we decide to have there. I think that it's very difficult sometimes to have the women that are on the streets, the women that are working, the women that are in the informal economy, the ones that they tell their own stories, but we need them to tell their own stories. It's not the same if I tell your story than if you tell your own story. And that means that you have to lose a little bit control over the overall narrative and give voice to those that normally have not the ability to speak. Why are you angry? Why are you on the streets? What are you doing? And also, what are your achievements? I mean, it's not all negative, but those voices that we privilege, I think, or highlight is also very important. And then recognizing also strengths and weaknesses. I mean, of course, we have in Mexico, for example, and I work a lot with media in Colombia, in Brazil, in Chile, in Argentina. We work across the region. Of course, there are a lot of good things happening, and we have to talk about all those good things that are happening. The women that are going are going through education, or the women that actually, I don't know, are doing well in businesses and so on. But we have to recognize those strengths and weaknesses. And I end with, in Mexico, it's almost certain that we're going to have a woman president this year. Which one, we don't know, but it's almost certain that we're going to have a woman as president. And And we don't have to take that for granted. I mean, because sometimes it's just like even when you see the news coverage, for example, in Mexico, it's not that we actually focus on we are going to have a woman as a president. In Mexico, which is a country that is still a very macho country, that is still a very violent country towards women, where it's not that easy that a woman can be something, and particularly not a president. And I think that we don't have to take that for granted, and we have to ask a lot of questions. For example, the candidates themselves. I have interviewed both women several times, and all the times I ask them, what difference does it make that a woman becomes president? What would the difference be if a woman becomes president? And if we don't ask that question, then it's just going to be an accident in history and not something that we can actually build on something. So we need to ask them all the time, what difference does it make that a woman becomes the president in a country like Mexico?
I think that this is also going into the social norms conversation. This is absolutely the reason why we shouldn't assume that everyone knows and understands why should we invest in women? Why should we advocate for women and girls' rights? Because we are assuming that everyone understands the reasoning behind it, but in reality, if the social norms are still so ingrained, not only in men's, but also in women's minds of gender roles and the preconceived and the notion of specific gender roles, we should challenge by questioning the difference and what that difference would make. I know that I'm out of time for this particular conversation, but I did want to ask this to all of you briefly. Next year, when we're celebrating International Women's Day again, what is one piece of legislation, what is one advancement, one specific advancement that you would like to be celebrating and that you hope that we can all be celebrating? I'm going to start with Laura. Laura, over to you for your birthday. What is this celebratory moment? Besides your birthday, what else should we be celebrating?
Well, thank you. Look, I think the theme to me is your voice matters, your power matters. I think women using their power is what's important. The famous French philosopher said, there is no love, there's only proof of love. I think it's the same with power. There is no power, there's only proof of power. And I think women collectively and individually need to use their voice to raise all of the issues that we've seen and to demand action against these things.
Thank you, Laura. Deputy Assistant Secretary.
Sure, I love Laura's high-minded answer, but I want to address two quick goals. At the basis level, I would love to see significantly more and continued investment in addressing gender-based violence. It is driving migration, it is driving families to have to leave, and it's affecting women's ability on every level to enter society and claim that power. And then the elevated goal I have is to see a much more robust conversation about the care economy. I love that people raised it. I think that a recognition of the contributions unpaid that women make, the cost of childcare, the impact on the economy, the more we raise this, the more we can better women and society as a whole.
Thank you. Maria Caridad.
Yes, I think I'm gonna be a little bit more pragmatic. I think that unfortunately we're living a moment where there is a lot of polarization in the society, and discussing gender equality is becoming an ideological and political issue and not an economic one. And gender equality is important for economic reasons. It's important for growth because our societies in Latin America are aging very rapidly, and if more women do not join the labor force, we won't be able to grow. Mm-hmm. Gender equality is important for productivity and efficiency reasons because talent is not being allocated to its best use when so many people are excluded from opportunities based on their gender or their gender identity or sexual orientation. But it is also a social justice issue. So I would welcome that next year when we talk about International Women's Day, we can really have a very pragmatic discussion on policies, budgets, and action, and take away that unnecessary ideological polarization. And yes, I'm not being naive. It is a political issue. There is an issue of redistribution of power too, and there will be winners and losers. But we are talking about a central economic issue for the development of the region, and I hope we can discuss it at that level a year from now.
Amazing.
And
Gabriela.
I take from what you say, because I think that we have to be more pragmatic, and not because the other thing is not important, but because if we don't do it in a pragmatic way, it's just not going to advance. So I think I would like to see a more pragmatic discussion on care economy. I mean, what it really means, and how you really can enforce or reinforce a care economy. And I also would like to see a much more pragmatic view on violence against women. What it means to society when there is violence against women, what it means, what it costs, and how it affects society. And as you say, of course, there's this whole framework, this whole polarization, this whole ideological framework, which we do not need to avoid. But I think that if we do not go a little bit more pragmatic, we're going to be stuck with this kind of stuff. And I just end with that. If we had a more broader discussion on what it means that women are in media, and the look of, or the gaze of a woman in media, if we have a pragmatic discussion on that, then we will have much more women in media than we have today.
And honestly, for all of these reasons, I hope that next year we can also see more men engaged in this conversation and, you know, raising the same flag. With that, I wanted to thank all of you. Laura, thank you so much for joining us. Deputy Assistant Secretary, it's a pleasure to have you. Maria Caridad, Gabriela, thank you so much. Honestly, please just we're going to take a quick break. Don't go too far. We're going to come back really soon for a conversation to go deeper into the Caribbean in particular in this report. Thank you so much, and I'll see you shortly.
Thank you.
Quiero que aunque norte y sur sean distintos, lleven un mismo latido en el ritmo, como quien comparte el mismo apellido, porque al fin y al cabo somos latinos. Quiero que la unión que logra la fuerza rompa divisiones y abra más puertas. Quiero que entendamos que cuando todos sumamos se hace la diferencia. Diversos como hay palabras en el diccionario, todos los significados usan el mismo abecedario. Yo soy como tú eres como yo. Cada reto juntos, si estamos juntos, sabe mejor cuando ganamos. Como tú eres como yo. No cierres el puño, que somos uno cuando queremos dar la mano. Soy como tú como yo. Soy como tú como yo. Soy como tú como yo. Soy como tú. juntos se hace la diferencia. Diversos como hay palabras en el diccionario. Todos los significados usan el mismo abecedario. Yo soy como tú eres como yo. Cada reto juntos, si estamos juntos, sabe mejor cuando ganamos como tú eres como yo. No cierres el puño, que somos uno cuando queremos dar la mano. Soy como tú como yo. Soy como tú como yo. Soy como tú como yo. Soy como tú. Este es el momento, ni antes ni después. No dejes para luego cuando hay tanto por hacer. Sempre há melhor caminho e o que temos percorrido serve pra crescer, serve pra aprender. Você é como eu, sou como você. Cada desafio será vencido se nos juntarmos pra você. É como eu, sou como você. Hora de ir pra frente, abre essa mente, vamos fazer acontecer. Soy como tú eres como yo. Cada reto juntos, si estamos juntos, sabe mejor cuando ganamos como tú eres como yo. No cierres el puño, que somos uno cuando queremos dar la mano como tú eres como yo. Cada reto juntos, si estamos juntos, sabe mejor cuando ganamos como tú eres como yo. No cierres el puño, que somos uno cuando queremos dar la mano.
Welcome back, and thank you to everybody that is joining us virtually and back in our studios. It's difficult to follow up some of the conversations that we've had, over the past sort of hour and a half, but we'll definitely try our best. Once again, thank Valentina Satter for moderating a great panel discussion recently, and to all of the panelists that joined her for that. I'm Wazim Maula. I'm the Associate Director and Fellow of the Caribbean Initiative here at the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center, and it's a really exciting day to have these conversations today. We've talked about gender challenges for women and girls at a macro level, and now we'll use this panel to dive a little bit deeper into the Caribbean itself. We've heard about these macro challenges, but when you look at the Caribbean is the world's most vulnerable region, meaning that the women and girls in the Caribbean are among some of the most vulnerable populations globally. The challenges facing women and girls in the Caribbean are amplified by the region's unique vulnerabilities to climate change, changing commodity prices, and rising inflation, and more. All of this has contributed to a gender crisis in the region, and it's something that we dive deep into for the new report that we're launching today. Again, you can scan the QR code or get a physical copy if you're lucky to join us here in person. As part of this report, which specifically focuses on the Caribbean, but we have a few case studies on Guyana and Jamaica where we traveled to late last year, we specifically argue that restructuring and reshaping of social norms alongside political and economic institutions is needed to achieve greater gender equality and empowerment. We tackle four key areas, including gender-based violence, limits on economic empowerment and political influence, and the disproportionate effects facing women and girls due to climate change. We state very clearly in this report that gender equity is the missing development tool for the wider Caribbean region. And to dive a little bit into these issues more deeply, we are joined by three distinguished speakers that bring an array of perspectives and insight to us today. First, to my left, we have Ambassador Jacinth Henry Martin, who is the Ambassador of St. Kitts and Nevis to the United States, and also serves as the country's permanent representative to the Organization of American States. Ambassador has a wide-ranging experience serving also already as ambassador to the U.S. In 2011, I believe you were the first female appointed ambassador to the United States. You were chief of staff to the OES Secretary General and previously served as Minister for Information, Culture, Sports, and Youth. Ambassador, I know it's your first time here at the Atlantic Council Studios. It's great to have you with us. Next, we have Patricia Francis, who is a good friend of the Caribbean Initiative since we started our programming about 3 years ago. Patricia's currently a director at Portland JSX and White Shield Partners, as well as chairperson of Jamaica's Trade Facilitation Task Force. Patricia's also served as the executive director of the International Trade Center and was special advisor for change to the executive director of UN Women. Patricia, thank you for coming all the way from Jamaica to be here in Washington with us. Last but not least, joining us virtually is Rolanda Campbell, who is a counselor and project officer at Childlink Guyana. Rolanda has focused for almost a decade on working as a psychotherapist and counselor for children and families who are victims of child sex abuse across Guyana. Rolanda, thank you so much for being here and taking time out of your busy day. As we mentioned at the top, today's conversation will drill down a little bit on the Caribbean. We'll talk at a high level of some of the issues facing women and girls across the region, and then we'll look at how we can implement solutions, not just talk about policy recommendations, but specifically implementing solutions. And where we want to kick it off today is, what are some of these main gender challenges? And I pose this question to all of you, first starting with you, Ambassador. What are some of the main gender challenges across the Caribbean, and specifically, how are they tying into some of the broader economic development barriers facing the wider region?
Thank you very much for the question. It is my absolute pleasure to be here. I want to extend to women in the audience and women who are participating virtually the very best for International Women's Day. With specific regard to the question, the challenges across the Caribbean and how do they tie into the broader economic development barriers. I think the earlier panel discussed this in pretty significant measure, but I'm going to have to mention gender-based violence as one of the main challenges we face. Gender-based violence diminishes very often the self-esteem and the confidence level of our women folk. It impacts the social fabric. Children, boys and girls who see gender-based violence in their homes learn that as a way of living, and so it becomes part of the vicious cycle. I also want to speak about very often limited access to education and opportunity for our women. Women constitute 50% of our populations. If we fail to educate them appropriately to offer opportunities for education, we are saying that 50% of our population can work to establish the directions to help us to reach our objectives, to maximize our efficiencies. We're leaving 50% of the population behind. The gender pay gap is very often a direct result of that, because after failing to provide opportunity and educating 50% of our population, we then say, you're not qualified to receive the same pay as a gentleman does. And even when we are equally qualified, the gender pay gap exists. Unvalidated and unpaid work for nurturing and care. That was referenced several times in the earlier conversation, and I believe that if it is not appreciated, if it's not validated, the question usually asks, why would a woman think that she ought to be paid for doing something that comes natural to her? We also have, as one of the challenges, limited access to financing, limited collateral to put up for any such financing, and gender biases that stem from that. These are all challenges which impact the broader vision and the broader goal and the broader capacity of women to contribute in the way that we would love to. I always say that if we want all hands on deck in the building of our countries, 50% of those hands belong to women. And so that has definitely to be taken on board. Development, the strengthening of democracy, these are areas in which women want to play our full role.
Thank you, Ambassador, and that's a great point. 50% of the population are women and girls. And I mean, as you and Patricia and the rest of the panelists know, is that Caribbean has significant capacity issues. When we think about across every single sector, we always talk about local capacity building is absolutely needed. I mean, it's a key feature of U.S. policy, for example, over the past few years. So that's a great point, tying directly to these broader economic issues. Patricia, I want to ask you the same question. I mean, you're a business leader both in the region and internationally. What are you seeing as some of these main gender challenges in the region?
Thank you very much, Wasim. And I also want to wish everyone a wonderful International Women's Day, and let's make sure that we celebrate really well today and every day. I think, I'll make a separate point to Ambassador, because I think that we haven't seen the education dividend in the region, because actually in most of the region we actually have more women graduating from tertiary education institutions than we have men, but women only represent 10% of the capital, of the assets of the region. So we are graduating, but we don't have the assets. And I think that this is really, really important thing to do, and it goes back to the pay inequality, and the lower paying jobs and access to assets, etc. What we are seeing is women in middle management positions, but we're not seeing them in the C-suites, and we're not seeing them in the boardroom. So this is something that really goes to the stereotypical positions of people who are in control. Mm-hmm. And if you look at both the listed companies and the family-owned businesses, it is a male-dominated perspective when you look at the C-suite. I mean, I come from a business family, and I was number 6 on out of 7 kids, and there were two boys ahead of me. And I knew early on that there was never going to be an opportunity for me to be anywhere in the leadership of these sets of businesses. And so I made a decision early on to go off on my own, and that was probably correct, because it wasn't until 2014 that I was actually invited to be on a board. So that was I had to prove myself first, But when you look at the government side, when you go from private sector to government, you are seeing leadership there from women. So you see women as permanent secretaries, you're seeing women as heads of agencies, government agencies. But you're not seeing women in politics. Mm-hmm. So on the other side of government, we're not seeing the leadership coming from women. We only have about 30% of our parliamentarians being women across the region. And then when you go to the other extreme and you start looking at the more marginalized women in our societies, those who are in the informal economy, we see much higher levels of unemployment among women. Of course, the disproportionate burden that they have for care, which everybody has spoken about. But I'll use one piece of data. In Jamaica, for instance, 58% of the poorest households are headed by single women. And 40% of the women-headed households consist of single parents. So we also have a family situation which we have to look at. Women leading their families, and this extra burden which we have there, and the consequence of that. But we all know that the economic empowerment of women is one of the most fundamental components of achieving gender equality and women's empowerment more broadly. The latest estimate by the World Bank shows that GDP per capita could be almost 20% higher if all gender employment gaps would be closed. And of course, within the Caribbean, this continues to be, we experience this inequality in the labor market, etc. So I think that there is a diverse number of issues that need to be faced, challenges that need to be met, and it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's a very comprehensive approach that we have to make in order to find solutions to these problems.
No, thank you, Patricia. And I think something to really take away from your comments is the importance of research and data. That was mentioned at the top in the fireside conversation, again in the panel. You can look at these numbers at a broad, superficial level and say, okay, we have X amount of parliamentarians or people heads of agencies, that are women. But then when you dive deeper into the numbers, you realize that it does not actually reflect the reality. So I think that's a great point to bring up. Rolanda, I want to go to you now. Specifically on some of the main challenges you're seeing, sitting there in Guyana, being in the region right now, particularly when it comes to gender-based violence. Can you share some of your thoughts on some of the main gender challenges?
All right, thank you so much for having me. Happy International Women's Day to all women across who are observing and across the world. Well, when I think of the issue of gender-based violence in the Caribbean, one of the first things that comes to mind is our history in the Caribbean. And when we think of how diverse the Caribbean is, and when we look at its history, we find that in regards to our religious beliefs, like for Guyana, for instance, we have 10 regions, and so we have different culture, different traditions. So it's a combination of so many things that would have led to this level of inequality. So when we think about our challenges in GBV in the Caribbean as a whole, then we must go back to some extent to our history. When we look at our religious beliefs, a lot of our religion in the Caribbean and the history of our religion in the Caribbean has birthed with women understanding that they are not, that men are superior, and therefore the narrative was promoted that way, and so society was formed, and it was formed that way, and so that is how persons are usually saying it, that women are supposed to be submissive, and this might not just be Christianity, this might be the other religious groups. And so therefore, when we understand that history and the root of the Caribbean, it is easy to see how GBV can, become one of the major phenomena throughout the Caribbean. But one of the challenges that I found and throughout the Caribbean is that the disempowerment of women in the Caribbean. When we have observed the history, like I've talked about, it has crippled because of what is happening and women accessibility, right, to the workplace, to be educated. And I spoke of diversity because when you think of the diversity and the density of the Caribbean, you think about the access to these services, the education that are available for women. Are they equally available for women? For men, are they equally available for women? The inability to acquire this education, the ability to be a part of the workforce, because if you're not qualified, then how are you going to be a part of the workforce, okay? We can also look at how can they, if they're not part of the workforce, how can they generally contribute to the economy as a whole? And so with that, we understand that it is hard for women, if they're not empowered, to add to the economy and to the development of the region as a whole. So I think when we think about that, in terms of the disempowerment of women and not being able to access these services offered, and how hard it would be to contribute to the region. For example, I can give an example for it. In Guyana, we have the hinterland where the indigenous persons are. More than one time over the years, I've engaged with them, and you can tell that it's a clear lack of services offered, a clear lack of access to basic education. And so the culture continues, the tradition continues. There is a lack of reformation as it relates to the society and socialization. And so even when you leave the city and you go there, you're taken back and you're faced with a culture shock to know that women are still operating at that level. And of course, that contributes and leaves cycles of poverty, cycles of abuse, and so it goes on because of lack of accessibility to educate women as a group. And so as a Caribbean, yes, we have come a long way, but there's so much that is needed in terms of empowering women and in terms of allowing all women to access the services and the education that is needed to bring awareness to them also, and to foster development to the region as a whole. So I think that we needed to take a little step back into our history and see how that has created a narrative and how it has formed culture and tradition that has led to the disempowerment so many times of women and girls across the Caribbean region.
Thank you, Rolanda. Great comments. I mean, one on the history side of things, I think one thing that makes the Caribbean very unique relative to Latin America and the rest of the hemisphere is that our countries have been independent 50, 60, 70 years. So a lot of that history is still really baked into the institutions that we're seeing that are contributing to some of these gender disempowerment. And then the aspect of diversity, I think is very important. I mean, in the report that we're launching today, we talk very specifically about policies that need to be contextualized to the local realities, not just at a country by country level, but even within countries, right? Guyana being a very good example of having Georgetown and then the hinterland regions being so very different. So we talked a little bit about some of these challenges and then got a little bit into some of the causes of it. What about some of the consequences, specifically when we think about gender-based violence? And as we think about diversity and how there's no one-size-fits-all solution, Ambassador, I want to go to you first, specifically, you know, from St. Kitts and Nevis, from the Eastern Caribbean, the OECS countries, you know, what are some of the consequences that arise out of gender-based violence and even some of the causes as well?
Thank you. Let me preface what I'm about to say by acknowledging the shared information by the Ministry of Social Development and Gender Affairs of St. Kitts and Nevis. I really want to thank them for the collaboration and to recognize the hard work that they do in ensuring that our women feel empowered and know that they do have recourse, certainly in the face of gender-based violence. In terms of causes and consequences of gender-based violence, I think I'm going to start with something that was just raised, cultural norms and stereotypes. Regrettably, traditional gender roles and stereotypes factor largely into not what happens alone, but what is deemed acceptable in a relationship. And unfortunately, these norms perpetuate circumstances in which women feel that they have to remain because it's normal, it's normalized in the context of our societies, unfortunately. We also have to reference economic inequality. Sometimes because there's great disparity in the income earning of males and females, very often women feel that they're forced to remain in a situation that is clearly detrimental to their well-being because they have children, because they feel that they have nowhere else to go. And so economic inequality sometimes underpins a lot of what we as women are forced to simply settle for. And then, although quite a number of countries have passed legislation to speak directly to gender-based violence, a lot of these laws are not given the teeth they need to get in society. So they are on the books, but women do not get the necessarily follow-up. So there needs to be greater collaboration between the law enforcement, the judiciary, and follow-up by the various ministries and departments charged with policing, if you will, what is happening. And then there is the social stigma and shame that goes with coming forward and saying that you've been abused, that there has been violence in the home. It is a double-edged sword because we are asking women to come forward, or men for that matter, when there's gender-based violence, and then after they do, they pass significant shame because it is something, you know, in small societies, certainly in the Caribbean, in St. Kitts and Nevis and in smaller countries, since I've been asked to speak to that, everyone knows everyone. And everyone knows when there is gender-based violence in the home. And so the shame and stigma is also part and parcel of the equation. And then we have something that sometimes we do not factor into substance abuse. That is very often a cause and a consequence that follows you thereafter. For example, if persons who maybe engage in, let's say, social drinking. If you drink enough, at some point you lose your inhibitions, you lose your sense, you lose your value for your partner, and the slightest infraction results in gender-based violence. And so these are some of the causes, but the consequences are even more dire. Children, boys and girls, learn from what they live. And so in terms of the intergenerational impact of children having to live in situations, that itself creates a vicious cycle, repetition. The physical and psychological harm to the person who is suffering and to the kids who have seen a parent suffering, that also is a consequence of gender-based violence. The cost to society of persons having to take time off from work, or in the case where the violence results in someone having to be hospitalized, or even worse, to be committed, because it has an ongoing impact. You know, there's mental stress, psychological stress. And so the cost to society is one that has to be factored into all of this. But something that is equally important, yet intangible, is the undermining and the erosion of the progress and the message that governments, that civil society have been trying to send, that it is not appropriate to engage in gender-based violence. The repetition over time of that in society undermines the very message that we try to send on a continuous basis. And so the causes and the consequences require sustained effort over time and lots of partnerships between government, between corporate society, between NGOs and civil society, to ensure that the message remains strong, that there is a robust campaign for awareness, and that we demonstrate not just on paper, but in actuality, that there is zero tolerance for gender-based violence.
Thank you, Ambassador. And that aspect, legislation that needs teeth, is something we're going to come back to when we talk a little bit about solutions and implementation. But this idea of the intergenerational impact, we find very important. I mean, working with UN Women over the past year or so, something that we've been working on is, how do we create, discussions that are intergenerational, understanding this type of impact that you discussed, the cost to society, undermining the progress. These are some dire, like you said, dire consequences that last, not just in a year or 2 years, but for decades. Patricia, I want to go to you. We traveled to Jamaica late last year. We met with a number of civil society organizations, and overwhelmingly, we talked a lot about gender challenges, but the overwhelming challenge that we spoke about was gender-based violence, and it was something that was consistently brought up to us. So we'd love to get your perspective from Jamaica on this particular issue.
Well, thank you very much, and they're very similar to the experience that we have in St. Kitts and Nevis. What I can give you some data, since we spoke about data before. Indeed, the two most common forms of violence that we have are about jealousy and financial problems. So when we look at jealousy, we see that 35.3% of the gender-based violence that takes place is as a result of jealousy. 18.1% relates to financial problems. When a partner disobeys, 14.9%, that's an interesting behavioral one. Problems within his or the partner's family, 13.8%. When partner complains, 12.8%, and 1 in 10 mentions that they have no particular reason why they are physically violent with their partner. So, this is the data, and these are the areas that, things that we see on a day-to-day basis. So the simple solution to conflict resolution is not there, and the result is violence. And because we have this culture of violence, which was spoken about before, this is something that comes back from our history of slavery and so forth. This culture of violence, we have been working hard, we've been putting legislation in place, but we still have that behavior which seems to be ingrained in our culture, this culture of violence. And, you know, Jamaica has one of the highest rates of violence against women in the world, 9.33 women killed per 100,000. In 2020, 39% of ever partnered women aged 15 to 64 in Jamaica had experienced one or more or 4 types of intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Physical, both physical, sexual, psychological. So consequences, you know, when you're exposed, this is, as you said, not only to the person who is being abused, but to the family who is exposed to it, the mental health challenges that creates is really important that we understand that. And findings, we have some findings which we've worked with UN Women on. More than 75% of women who have faced gender-based violence have more mental health issues. 62% were mild, 27% moderate, and 11% have severe mental health issues. So that then translates into the whole society and how that's treated and how we, you know, how we respond to that is something which I don't think society has come to terms with. So, you know, the social and economic fallout from gender-based violence, certainly we talked about the loss of livelihood, the increased gender inequalities, and this is a self-perpetuating thing. And this is why this is critical for something that we need to face, something that we need to find solutions to, and something we need to talk about. We need to bring it out into the open. We need to be able to talk about it. I work in a city community, and we have a group of women that we work with, the 18 to 80 program, and it's supported by the King's Trust out of the UK. And sitting down with these women, you know, we teach them how to do small things like crocheting, but it's really a therapy session, and they talk. And we had a situation where a mother was talking about abuse and how she had been abused. And sitting in the same group was her daughter, who never knew about the abuse of her mother, and then began to speak about the abuse she was receiving from the same person. And here we were in one family, abuse being handed down from one to the other. And it is a real situation that unless we can treat with this mental health problem, we're going to see this perpetuating and we won't be able to solve the problem. So we need to dive down into how we deal with this social but also economic problem.
Thank you, Patricia, and that's a good segue into what I think we need to talk about next. I mean, first, based on all the comments we've heard so far, and looking at my co-author Valentina, we probably have, you know, this is probably one of probably about 10 reports that we definitely need to write. But you know, let's start to talk about implementation. Right? We're coming up on time, so we have, you know, in a very brief way, but promising that this is not the final conversation that we have about this. This is probably the beginning of many. But Rolando, I want to go to you. You know, you're bringing in the civil society perspective. Ambassador talked about legislation with teeth. Patricia talked a lot about policy solutions and implementation. It's something we talk about in the report. How can civil society aid in the efforts to ensure that policies and legislations that are passed, there is an implementation mechanism, right? Ambassador talked about it being a sustained effort. What role can civil society organizations like yours and others play? And then we'll go to Ambassador at a government level, and then we'll finish with Patricia at a business level. But Rolanda, please.
All right. Thank you so much again. So when I think of what role we can play in the civil society organization, I think it takes me back to what we've been doing at our level. And in conducting work with girls and women across Guyana, and networking with other partners across the region, one of the things that was very predominant about it was that we were able to observe that there were so much cycles of poverty. Now, you had asked before about cause and consequences. Now, this can allude to both. We found that the cycles of poverty was a causal factor into gender-based violence, and it was also a consequence of gender-based violence. And therefore, as a civil society organization engaging with families, we found that this was, high percentage among our group of children or families that I've worked with. So for instance, like myself, I work at the child advocacy centers across Guyana, and we have come a long way over the past decade. We were one center at one time in one region. We have 10 regions, and so now we were able to have 10 child advocacy centers in each region. And we can clearly see that the cycles of poverty has been distributing across the region. Now, as a civil society organization, we've been trying to engage the families and see how much can be done. When you look at the amount of resources that are given into the families, while we do appreciate what has been given, it is so much important that we recognize there's so much more that can be done for the families. I would engage, last year would have engaged maybe 100, 200 girls just conducting forensic interviews on child sexual abuse. And of course, that engagement did not only rest with the children, because we not only work with the girls in isolation, we also work with their mothers. And what we found, like I mentioned before, that these are cycles that are happening. So most likely, like the speaker before would have mentioned, it would have happened to the mother, because in my own experience, while getting the disclosure for the police in terms of alleged sexual abuse, there are many times I asked to engage that parent who is observing the interview, because it would have, memories of horror abuse might have come into play, and it might not have been sexual abuse, but it might have been gender-based violence on that level, and it might have been the same perpetrator. So these are all areas, and I wanted us to look at what we're doing first to know how we can move forward, all right? We have been making interventions at that level, and so when we think about the Child Advocacy Center too, we think about now that we're in 10 regions, the children have the access to that. So what can the civil society organization do now as it relates to gender-based violence? One of the things that we're thinking that we can do as an organization, as a group, is that the referral process, like I've talked about, but how can we advocate for women throughout the region, not just Guyana, but throughout the region, to have that access like the children do? So for the child advocacy centers, you'll find that we have the children will have access to the police, the child protection officers, and the trauma counselors, or the therapeutic, the person who will offer that psychosocial support right on center. It's a one-stop shop. So we have come a long way with that, but I don't think we can, it is safe to say that we have that for our women who are victims of gender-based violence. In that regard, where the accessibility to all the necessary networking partners that they need to help bring that justice or whatever it is that we're looking for women and equality, we don't think that has been yet solid in our region. We feel like, that is needed. Advocacy centers for women where they have access to the police, and because there's still a run around that women are complaining, and even engaging with families, I find that a lot of women will come to say, I am tired. I don't want to go through with the case. I want to withdraw from this thing because I am frustrated by the judicial system. And with that, there is a decline also in justice for social ills and social ills such as gender-based violence as it relates to the region. And therefore, it hinders the development for the region. Because if there's no justice in that aspect, then how can we grow as a region? How can we eradicate these dysfunctional behavior or patterns that we were so led to believe that women are, we are not as equal, don't have equal rights as men. And so as a civil society organization, I think that is something that we can definitely bear more work into, given women that right and that easy accessibility to the services that they need to get them into a place of full healing and recovery. I think with that too, we will avoid re-victimization because it happens a lot. Over the 10 years working in the Child Advocacy Center, it is amazing at how many children and re-victimization that occurs in the family setting. And so, for example, you might find that a lot of young girls who, remain in the abuse and allow themselves to be re-victimized by the given perpetrator, just to ensure that the family is safe and to ensure that, because maybe some of the social constraints might be because the inability to know how they will be provided for, and mothers who also made, and I have girls who have always also disclosed that they've mentioned what was happening in the home to their mothers, but mommy decided to maybe cover it up because if we leave, what will happen to us? If we just try to avoid the perpetrator. And so the mother suffers from some form of physical abuse, and the children continues to suffer with sexual abuse. So there's that cycle of abuse, and of course there's re-victimization. So as a civil society organization, we've been trying to target that, but there's so much more resources needed to put into that. And there's so much resources needed even more to empower women and to create that advocacy center. I don't know what we might term it, but the advocacy center, so that we can have women have those free accesses to the services, just as we've been doing at the child advocacy centers across Guyana and I think in 1 or 2 Caribbean countries.
Yes. Thank you, Rolanda. Taking away from that, civil society needing access and then also access to resources as well. So as we come up on time, Ambassador, want to get your perspective on implementation as some final thoughts briefly. At a government level, what that looks like. You talked specifically about sustaining implementation legislation with teeth, and then Patricia will wrap up with you from the business side of things.
Thank you very much. Again, I want to commend in St. Kitts and Nevis the Ministry of Social Development and Gender Affairs. They are guided by a gender equality policy and action plan known as GPAP, which really underpins all the robust and responsive action in St. Kitts and Nevis in responding to gender issues. But in terms of some of the solutions, I would say certainly, and I'm not speaking just in terms of St. Kitts and Nevis, where a lot of really excellent work has been done, but I'm speaking about in the Caribbean more as a region. Certainly, a strict policy that is clearly articulated and repeated regularly, zero tolerance for gender-based violence. Legal reform where it is applicable and where it needs to be modernized, because we may have started with something small, but when data presents itself, then we have to respond to that. So legal reform, more stringent law enforcement, and a robust justice system. Moving along, I would say promoting prevention in the first case, but certainly also promoting the need to report when something happens. If you're going to keep quiet about it at home, the situation is unlikely to change. And I want to speak about education. And I'm not just speaking about awareness campaigns. I'm actually speaking about going into the schools, maybe some form of civic education, some studies to boys and girls alike, that gender-based violence is not all right. I think it needs to be ongoing. I think it needs to be age appropriate, and I think it needs to be from kindergarten right up, that there is constant reinforcement of that idea. Data collection and research. If we're going to be acting, we may as well be acting on actual statistics. So data collection is important. And I want to just speak also, because I know time is of essence, about partnerships. We are all in this thing together. Men, women, the government, civil society, and we need the corporate buy-in so that even in business, there is a zero tolerance policy that everyone is aware of at the same time. I'll hand over because I know that time is moving along.
Thank you.
Good, thank you very much. And you handed over on the right note because, you know, I'm a part of Portland Private Equity. And one of the things that we insist in our investor agreement is that there is a policy with respect to sexual harassment and an understanding from our HR departments as to you know, how these things are being handled within the human resource policies of these companies that we invest in. And I'll give you an example of Liberty Latin America, which is, I think, the one who is, I think we call them Flo in Jamaica. Yes. So they have a zero tolerance policy for sexual harassment in there, and any kind of harassment whatsoever. And so they not only have a training program for their employees, but they have a huge awareness building program, and they understand. They understand. We've been training their people to look for signs, so that they can go out and call people into the office to say, you know, we think something is happening in the family. You know, is there something we can do? So I think, you know, this is critical and important. But we, as an investor, check to see whether there has been any action within the company itself to see whether they're actually following up and not just speaking to, but actually acting on. And this is what we do in all our companies that we invest in. But I think the World Bank has come up with an important number, saying that the gender-based violence is estimated to cost US $1.5 trillion a year, which is approximately 2% of global GDP. So, I mean, for those people who don't actually care, for those people who care about money and profits, they should be looking at how is this is something they have to be aware of. 2% on your bottom line is a big thing, and I think it's something that we really have to take care of. So, you know, it's not only important for the health of our countries, of our people, but I think it's important for the bottom line as well. And investing in women is going to be important going forward to make sure that we are contributing to our own development, etc.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Patricia. I mean, just quickly, you know, we talked about access, advocacy centers, resources, zero tolerance policy, legal reform, law enforcement, prevention, the need to report, you know, data collection, everything. You know, we have a lot to follow up on. We are unfortunately running out of time, but I want to quickly thank Patricia, the ambassador, and Rolanda for joining us, for incredible insights and comments that we'll definitely be following up on because we need sustained policy solutions. But would like to quickly turn it over to Tony Ann Broadberg, representative of the UN Women Multi-Country Office, Caribbean, for closing remarks. Tony, your partnership and friendship is always great, and it's so great to see you. Next time, hopefully it's going to be here in DC. Tony, over to you.
Thank you so much, Wazim, and I do look forward to being in DC the next time as well. It's fantastic to be able to have heard not only this panel, but to learn from the beginning with the fireside chat with Maria Noel. As Maria Noel noted in her initial comments, if we do not invest in women, we will not see progress on gender equality. As you noted in the summary, we cannot look at progress without having data, efficient data, available data. Recently, the Caribbean Regional Statistics Program run out of CARICOM noted the importance of having independent statistical offices to be able to do this. And Jamaica has started, and because of that, we have the data as to how many women are experiencing violence in Jamaica. The first country to do that, we now have 5 across the Caribbean. Ambassador, we hope to be able to get that prevalence data study as well done in St. Kitts and Nevis. What we know is that without civil society, and thanks so much, Rolanda, we will not be able to deliver on gender equality. We know as well that the economic empowerment basis, as Patricia Francis said, is the foundation to gender equality. Without it, women will not be able to make the kind of informed choices they need to if they're leaving violent relationships. But that violence against women and girls is only one form of the manifestation of gender inequality, not only in the Caribbean, but across Latin America. Our colleagues in the other panel spoke to the fact that when a woman has a child, their productivity in the labor market goes down 20 to 30%. This unpaid care responsibility must be prioritized if we're to see women fully engaging not only in our economy, but in our leadership. We look forward to working collaboratively with the Atlantic Council on policy solutions and supporting governments and civil society as we have been in the past, and with our partners across the UN system to deliver for women and girls through investment, through action, and through evidence-based policy. Have a wonderful International Women's Day. We look forward to increased investment in women so that we can accelerate progress.
Quiero que aunque norte y sur sean distintos, lleven un mismo latido en el ritmo, como quien comparte el mismo apellido, porque al fin y al cabo somos latinos. Quiero que la unión que logra la fuerza rompa divisiones y abra más puertas. Quiero que entendamos que cuando todos sumamos se hace la diferencia. Diversos como hay palabras en el diccionario, todos los significados usan el mismo abecedario. Yo soy como tú.